Welcome to Storytales. Please like this video and subscribe to Storytales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. Miles Vance checked his watch as he pulled into the driveway of the two-story colonial he'd renovated with his own hands. 6:30 on the dot. He was nothing if not punctual. The October sun had already begun its descent, casting long streams of amber light across the manicured lawn he'd spent countless weekends perfecting. He grabbed his leather portfolio from the passenger seat of his truck, the vehicle a testament to practicality rather than flash. The truck bore the logo of Vance Renovations on both doors, simple, straightforward, just like the man who had built the business from scratch. Inside, the smell of garlic and herbs greeted him. Cheryl was cooking. His wife of 7 years moved around the kitchen with the easy grace that had first caught his attention all those years ago. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a messy bun, tendrils escaping to frame her face. She looked up when the door closed behind him, her smile bright. "You're home right on time," she said, stirring something on the stove. Miles set his portfolio on the counter and washed his hands in the sink. Johnson's project wrapped up today, on time and under budget. Cheryl nodded appreciatively. She understood what that meant. Another satisfied client, another referral, another brick in the foundation of the business Miles had built through sheer determination and meticulous planning. "That's great," she said, but there was something off in her tone. Miles had spent enough time reading blueprints to know when measurements didn't quite add up. There was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there yesterday. "Everything okay?" he asked, reaching for the bottle of red wine they kept for weeknight dinners. "Nothing fancy, just reliable. My parents called today. They're coming over for dinner tomorrow." Cheryl stirred the pasta sauce with more force than necessary. Miles poured 2 glasses of wine and set one near Cheryl. "Any special occasion? Delaney and Jack will be with them." The name of his sister-in-law made something tighten in Miles' chest. He took a measured sip of wine before responding. "I have a meeting with a potential client tomorrow evening." "You don't," Cheryl said, looking at him with knowing eyes. "I check your calendar on the fridge." Miles met her gaze steadily. "I could." "Miles." His name was both a plea and a reprimand on her lips. "Fine." He set his glass down with a controlled motion. "But I'm not pretending to be impressed by whatever scheme your sister is wrapped up in this time." "She's family," Cheryl said, her voice taking on that defensive edge it always did when Delaney was the topic of conversation. "Family doesn't mean automatic approval," Miles replied, the words well-worn between them. Cheryl sighed and turned back to the stove. "Just be civil." "For me." Miles watched her for a moment, noting the slight slump of her shoulders. He moved behind her and placed a hand on her waist, a small gesture of concession. "I'm always civil. It's one of my better qualities." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. One of many. The evening passed with the comfortable routine they'd established over the years. Dinner at the kitchen island, conversation about work, a shared bottle of wine. But there was an undercurrent of something Miles couldn't quite place, like the sensation before a storm when the air goes still. The next evening arrived with unwelcome speed. Miles had spent the day at a job site, overseeing the demolition phase of a kitchen renovation. He'd lingered longer than necessary, checking and rechecking measurements that he'd already verified 3 times. When he finally arrived home, Cheryl was bustling around the kitchen. The dining room, table rarely used except for these obligatory family gatherings, was set with their wedding china. "They'll be here in 20 minutes, she said, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal. "Could you change into something that doesn't have drywall dust on it?" Miles glanced down at his clothes and nodded. He headed upstairs, taking each step with deliberate slowness. In their bedroom, he changed into dark jeans and a navy button-down, presentable but not trying too hard. A compromise like so many things in marriage. The doorbell rang just as he was coming back downstairs. Cheryl shot him a look equal parts warning and plea before opening the door. Sandra Foster swept in first, a cloud of floral perfume announcing her arrival seconds before she wrapped Cheryl in a tight embrace. Frank followed, clapping Miles on the shoulder with the awkward familiarity of a man who had never quite warmed to his son-in-law. And then came Delaney. Where Cheryl was sunshine and warmth, Delaney was calculated flash and sharp edges. Her blonde hair was professionally highlighted, her clothes expensively casual, her smile practiced. Jack trailed behind her, his handshake too firm, his grin too wide, his eyes never quite connecting with Miles. "The place looks great," Jack said, glancing around with the air of a man appraising property. "You do this work yourself, Miles?" "Every inch," Miles replied, the pride in his work evident despite his distaste for the man asking. "Shame you don't have a bigger yard," Delaney cut in, peering through the window to the modest backyard. "But I guess you get what you pay for." Miles caught Cheryl's eye across the room, saw the silent apology there. This was why he avoided these gatherings. The little digs, the subtle ways Delaney reminded them that her lifestyle funded by alimony from 2 ex-husbands and Jack's questionable business ventures was superior. "Dinner's ready," Cheryl announced, steering the conversation away from dangerous waters. They settled around the dining table, Jack immediately launching into a story about his latest business deal. Miles listened with half an ear, recognizing the hallmarks of a man describing castles built on sand. Frank and Sandra hung on every word, occasionally glancing at Miles as if to say, "See what success looks like." Miles sipped his water and cut his roast with precise movements. He learned long ago that engaging only led to frustration. "So," Delaney said during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying that rehearsed casual tone that always preceded an announcement, "Jack and I have some news." Sandra clasped her hands together. "Oh, are you two finally tying the knot?" Delaney laughed, the sound like crystal against concrete. "God, no. Marriage hasn't exactly been a winning strategy for me so far." She shot a meaningful look at Miles. No offense to those who still believe in the institution. Miles raised his glass slightly. "None taken." "Actually," Jack jumped in, draping an arm around Delaney's shoulders, "we've decided to start a family." The table fell silent. Miles felt his fork pause halfway to his mouth. Delaney had always been vocally opposed to motherhood, citing everything from career ambitions to her perfect figure as reasons to remain childless. "That's unexpected," Miles said finally, when it became clear no one else was going to speak. Delaney smiled, something sharp hiding behind her eyes. "Well, we've been talking about it for a while. Haven't we, Jack?" Jack nodded enthusiastically. "It's time to settle down, build something lasting." Frank cleared his throat. "Well, this is wonderful news. When are you planning to start trying?" The question hung in the air for a beat too long. "Actually," Delaney said, her gaze sliding to Cheryl, "that's where we were hoping for some help." Miles felt something cold settle in his stomach. "The thing is," Delaney continued, "I've been to a few doctors, and they all say the same thing. My uterus is, well, it's not ideal for carrying a child. Something about the shape or whatever, which is totally fine," Jack added quickly. "We have options." Delaney reached across the table and took Cheryl's hand. "Little sister, you've always been a nurturing one, the one who wanted a big family." Miles watched his wife's face, saw the mixture of emotions flickering across it. Something wasn't right here. This wasn't the first time he was hearing this conversation. "What exactly are you asking?" Miles said, his voice level but with an edge that made Jack shift in his seat. "We want Cheryl to be our surrogate," Delaney said, turning her gaze to Miles, a challenge in her eyes. "She's already agreed to consider it." The room went still. Miles looked at Cheryl, who wouldn't meet his eyes. The pieces clicked into place: her distraction, the tension, the family dinner scheduled without consulting him first. "I see," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "And when were you planning to discuss this with me, Cheryl?" Sandra jumped in. "It's such a beautiful thing, Miles. Cheryl helping her sister have a family." "It's more than that," Miles said, not taking his eyes off his wife. "It's 9 months of pregnancy. It's hormones and doctor's appointments and physical changes. It's a lifetime of connection to a child." He finally looked at Delaney and Jack. "And it's a decision that affects my marriage. It's Cheryl's body," Delaney said, her voice taking on that victim's edge that she wielded so effectively. "Shouldn't it be your choice?" "Of course it is," Miles said. "But marriage is supposed to be a partnership. Major decisions are discussed, not announced at dinner parties." "It's not like that," Cheryl finally spoke, her voice small. "I was going to talk to you about it tonight. after everyone left. I wanted you to hear what it meant to Delaney and Jack first. Miles set his napkin on the table and stood. Excuse me for a moment. He walked out of the dining room, through the kitchen, and onto the back porch. The night air was cool against his face. He braced his hands on the railing and took several deep breaths. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn. You're embarrassing me, Cheryl said, her voice tight. I'm embarrassing you? Miles turned to face her. You made a life-altering decision without even mentioning it to me, and I'm embarrassing you. I didn't make a decision, Cheryl insisted. I said I'd think about it. Your sister already told your parents. Jack is talking about nursery colors. That doesn't sound like thinking about it to me. Cheryl wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly in the cool air. They really want this, Miles, and I could give them this gift. Is that so terrible? It's not about the giving. It's about who you're giving to, Miles said, lowering his voice. Delaney has never taken responsibility for anything in her life. And Jack, the man changes his mind about what tie to wear 3 times a day. You think they're prepared to be parents? People rise to the occasion. Some people do, Miles agreed. But your sister isn't some people. She's the woman who borrowed $10,000 from us for her dream business and then used it to take Jack to Bali. She's the woman who had you drive 4 hours to pick her up when her second marriage fell apart, only to reconcile with a guy a week later without so much as a thank you. She's still my sister, Cheryl said, as if that explained everything. Miles shook his head. And you're still my wife. But right now, it doesn't feel like you're acting like it. Miles, the back door opened, and Sandra poked her head out. Everything okay out here? Fine, Cheryl said quickly. We're just getting some air. Well, Jack's about to open some champagne. To celebrate. Miles brushed past Sandra without a word and walked back into the dining room. Jack was indeed opening a bottle of champagne, the cork popping with an inappropriate festiveness. There he is, Jack exclaimed. No hard feelings, right, man? I know it's a lot to process. Miles looked around the table at Jack's insincere smile, at Delaney's triumphant expression, at Frank and Sandra's expectant faces, and finally at Cheryl, who had followed him back inside, a plea in her eyes. I haven't agreed to anything, Cheryl said, her voice steadier than before. I need to discuss it with Miles first. Properly. A flash of annoyance crossed Delaney's face before she smoothed it into a sympathetic smile. Of course, sweetie. Take all the time you need. She reached for her champagne flute. But let's celebrate the possibility, at least. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tense smiles and careful conversation. Miles said little, observing the dynamic play out. The way Sandra fawned over Delaney's every word. The way Frank slapped Jack on the back like he was already a father. The way Cheryl seemed torn between familial obligation and marital respect. When they finally left, Miles closed the door behind them with a quiet finality. We need to talk, he said to Cheryl, who was already gathering plates from the table. Can it wait until morning? I'm exhausted. No, Miles said. It can't. Cheryl set the plates down with a sigh. Fine, let's talk. Miles moved to the living room, waiting for Cheryl to follow. He sat on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in front of him. Cheryl perched on the armchair across from him, tension evident in every line of her body. I'm not going to pretend I'm okay with this, Miles began, his voice controlled. I'm not. You haven't even given it a chance, Cheryl said. You just shut down the minute Delaney mentioned it. Because it's a terrible idea, Miles replied. And deep down, you know it is. Cheryl shook her head. No, I don't. I think it could be beautiful. I could help give my sister a child. At what cost? Miles leaned forward. Have you really thought about what this means? 9 months of pregnancy. Morning sickness, doctor's appointments, physical discomfort. The emotional toll of carrying a child and then giving it away. I've thought about all of that. Have you thought about what happens if they change their minds? Miles pressed. Because they will, Cheryl. Your sister changes her mind about everything. That's not fair, Cheryl said, her voice rising slightly. Delaney has been through a lot. Most of it's self-inflicted, Miles pointed out. She leaves a trail of chaos wherever she goes, and your parents clean it up. And when they can't, guess who she calls? You. And guess who has to watch you bend over backward to fix her messes? Me. Cheryl stood abruptly. She's family, Miles. Family helps each other. Family doesn't take advantage, Miles countered, rising to meet her. Family doesn't make decisions that affect others without consultation. Family doesn't manipulate. She's not manipulating me. Isn't she? Miles asked quietly. Think about it, Cheryl. She announced this at a family dinner, with your parents there, creating maximum pressure. She talked about it like you'd already agreed. She had Jack open champagne. Every bit of that was calculated. Cheryl paced to the window, staring out at the darkness. You've never liked her. I've never trusted her, Miles corrected. There's a difference. She wants a family, Cheryl said, turning back to him. Is that so hard to understand? No, Miles admitted. What's hard to understand is why it has to be you. There are professional surrogates. There's adoption. There are options that don't involve appending our marriage. It wouldn't append our marriage unless you let it. Miles felt a flare of anger. So this is on me? I'm supposed to just smile and nod while my wife makes a unilateral decision that affects both of us for the next year, minimum. It's my body, Miles, Cheryl said, her eyes flashing. My choice. The words hung between them, sharp and divisive. Miles took a step back, something inside him going cold and still. You're right, he said finally. It is your body, and it is your choice. But choices have consequences, Cheryl. And if you choose this, if you choose your sister and her whims over our marriage, don't expect me to stand by and watch it implode. What does that mean? Cheryl asked, a hint of fear creeping into her voice. It means I'm giving you a warning. Something your sister never bothers to do before she pulls people in her drama. Miles met her gaze directly. If you do this, don't expect me to stick around when it blows up in your face. Are you threatening to leave me? Cheryl's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm telling you where my line is, Miles said. Everyone has one. This is mine. Cheryl stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. I can't believe you'd throw away 7 years of marriage over this. I'm not the one doing the throwing, Miles replied. Think about it, Cheryl. Really think. Not about what Delaney wants, or what your parents expect, or what Jack is pushing for. Think about us. Think about what this would mean for our relationship. He turned and walked to the door, grabbing his keys from the hook. Where are you going? Cheryl asked, alarm evident in her voice. For a drive, Miles said. I need some air, and you need time to think without me standing here. He left without waiting for her response, the door closing firmly behind him. Miles drove aimlessly for over an hour, his thoughts churning. He'd built his life around certain principles. Honesty, hard work, loyalty, and, yes, decisiveness. When something wasn't right, he didn't waste time pretending otherwise. Cheryl had known that about him from the beginning. It was one of the things she'd said attracted her to him, his clarity, his straightforwardness. No games, she told her friends. What you see is what you get. The irony wasn't lost on him. When he finally returned home, the house was dark except for a single lamp in the living room. Cheryl was curled up on the sofa, a throw blanket pulled around her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed. I shouldn't have brought it up that way, she said as he sat in the armchair across from her. I should have talked to you first, privately. Yes, Miles agreed. You should have. But that doesn't change how I feel, she continued. Delaney wants this so badly, Miles. And I want to help her. Miles studied her face, the face he'd woken up to for 7 years. More than you want our marriage to stay intact. That's not fair, Cheryl said, her voice cracking. Why does it have to be one or the other? Because I know your sister, Miles said simply. And I know Jack. This isn't going to go the way you think it will. They're not ready for a child, Cheryl. And when they realize that you'll be left holding the bag. Or in this case, the baby. You don't know that. I do, Miles insisted. Jack can't even commit to a car lease, let alone a child. The man traded in his BMW after 3 months because he decided he didn't like the color. And Delaney? When has she ever seen anything through to the end? People change, Cheryl argued, especially when a baby is involved. Some do, Miles conceded. But let me ask you this. Are you willing to bet our marriage on Delaney and Jack suddenly becoming responsible adults? Cheryl didn't answer, which was answer enough. Think about it, Miles said, standing up. Really think. I'm going to bed. He left her on the sofa, staring into the middle distance. The next morning, Miles woke to an empty bed. He found Cheryl in the kitchen, already dressed, a cup of coffee in front of her. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble. Miles poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, waiting. "I want to do this," Cheryl said, her voice steady. "I want to help Delaney and Jack have a baby." Miles set his cup down carefully. "I see. But I also want our marriage to work," she continued. "I love you, Miles. I don't want to lose you over this." "Then don't do it," Miles said simply. Cheryl shook her head. "It's not that simple. It is, actually. It's a choice, Cheryl. One choice among many that we make every day. This one just happens to have bigger consequences than most. Why can't you support me in this?" Cheryl asked, a pleading note entering her voice. "Why can't you see how important it is to me?" "Because I see what you don't," Miles replied. "I see the aftermath. I see you being used and then discarded when it becomes inconvenient. I see our life being turned upside down for people who don't deserve your loyalty." "You're being dramatic." "I'm being realistic," Miles corrected. "Something your family has never been particularly good at." Cheryl stood abruptly. "I've made my decision." Miles nodded once. "So have I." They stared at each other across the kitchen, the morning light casting harsh shadows between them. "I'm going to my parents for a few days," Cheryl said finally. "I need some space to think." "About what?" Miles asked. "You just said you've made your decision." "About us," Cheryl replied, her voice small. "About how to make this work." Miles watched as she gathered her purse and keys. "Cheryl," he said as she reached the door, "I meant what I said last night. If you do this, don't expect me to stick around when it blows up in your face." Cheryl paused, her hand on the doorknob. "It won't come to that," she said, not turning around. "You'll see. Everything will work out." The door closed behind her with a quiet click. 3 months passed in a strange limbo of polite distance. Cheryl had gone ahead with the surrogacy process, medical screenings, legal paperwork, the implantation procedure. Miles had watched it all with a detached sort of resignation, maintaining a coldly civil facade while pulling away emotionally. They still shared meals occasionally, still slept in the same bed, still moved around each other in the routines of daily life. But the easy intimacy that had characterized their marriage was gone, replaced by careful choreography and surface-level conversation. Miles threw himself into his work, taking on more projects than usual, staying late at job sites, bringing paperwork home to occupy his evenings. He started going to the gym more often, finding solace in the physical exertion and the mindless repetition of weights being lifted and lowered. Cheryl, for her part, seemed determined to pretend everything was normal. She asked about his day, cooked his favorite meals, tried to engage him in discussions about future plans. But there was a desperate quality to her efforts, a brittleness that hadn't been there before point one evening. Miles came home later than usual, having spent extra time at a job site resolving an issue with a subcontractor. The house was quiet, the lights dimmed. He found Cheryl in the living room, curled on the sofa with a book she wasn't really reading. "There's pasta in the fridge if you're hungry," she said without looking up. Miles nodded, though she wasn't watching. "Thanks." He went to the kitchen, reheated a plate of pasta, and ate standing at the counter, scrolling through emails on his phone. When he finished, he washed the plate and put it away. Cheryl appeared in the doorway. "You're avoiding me," she said, one hand resting on her slightly rounded stomach. Miles looked at her directly. "Yes." The simple honesty seemed to catch her off guard. "Why?" "You know why." Cheryl's face flushed. I hoped you'd come around. That you'd see this as a good thing." "A good thing," Miles repeated flatly. "For who, exactly?" "For Delaney, who gets what she wants without any of the work. For Jack, who can play at being a father without any real commitment. For you, who gets to be the family hero. Or for me, who has to watch my wife go through a pregnancy for a child that isn't ours, that we won't raise, that will connect her forever to people I don't trust." "For all of us," Cheryl insisted. "Family helping family." Miles let out a short, humorless laugh. "Keep telling yourself that." He started to walk past her, but she caught his arm. "You're really going to hold this against me forever?" she asked, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Miles looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. Forever is shorter than you think when trust is gone. He gently removed her hand and continued upstairs. The weeks turned into months. Spring gave way to summer. Cheryl's pregnancy progressed, her body changing, her movements slowing. Miles maintained his distance, civil, helpful when absolutely necessary, but emotionally unavailable. He slept in the guest room now, citing her comfort as the reason, though they both knew better. Delaney and Jack visited occasionally, making grand plans for the nursery, discussing names, talking about the future with an enthusiasm that rang false to Miles' ears. He observed them with clinical detachment, noting the way Jack's eyes would glaze over when Delaney talked about parenting philosophies, the way Delaney would check her phone whenever the conversation turned to practical matters like pediatricians or childcare. They seem excited, Cheryl said one evening after they'd left, her hand rubbing slow circles on her now prominent belly. They seem like they're playing house, Miles replied, gathering the coffee cups they'd left behind. But games end, Cheryl. Reality doesn't. July arrived with a heat wave that made the air shimmer above the pavement. Cheryl was 7 months along now. Her movements labored in the oppressive heat. Miles had installed additional ceiling fans and upgraded the home's air conditioning system, a concession to practical necessity rather than emotional reconciliation. He was working from home that day, reviewing blueprints at the dining table when the doorbell rang. Cheryl was upstairs resting, so he answered it. Delaney stood on the porch, her expression uncharacteristically serious. No Jack beside her. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past Miles into the house. Miles closed the door and followed her to the living room, where she paced in agitated circles. "Is Cheryl here?" Delaney asked, glancing around. "Upstairs, resting," Miles replied. "What do you want, Delaney?" She stopped pacing and faced him, something like defiance in her stance. "I need to talk to Cheryl first." "About what?" "It's between me and her." Miles crossed his arms. "Nothing about this situation is just between you and her." "Not anymore." Delaney glared at him, then seemed to deflate slightly. "Fine. Jack and we've been talking." "About?" "The baby," Delaney said, her voice dropping. We're not ready. It's not the right time." Miles felt a cold fury building inside him, but he kept his voice level. "Not ready," he repeated. 2 months before the due date. And suddenly you're not ready. "These things happen," Delaney said defensively. "People change their minds. It's better to realize it now than after the baby is born." Better for who? The question hung in the air between them. Delaney had the grace to look away first. "I need to tell Cheryl," she said finally. "It should come from me." "Yes," Miles agreed coldly. "It should." He led the way upstairs, knocking softly on the bedroom door before pushing it open. Cheryl was lying on her side, a pillow between her knees for support. She blinked awake at the sound of the door. "Delaney wants to talk to you," Miles said, his voice neutral. "I'll be downstairs." He left them alone, returning to the dining table where his blueprints waited. But he didn't look at them. Instead, he sat perfectly still, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation from upstairs. The low murmur of Delaney's voice. A period of silence. Then Cheryl's voice, rising in disbelief, in anger, in desperation. 20 minutes later, he heard the front door open and close as Delaney left. 5 minutes after that, Cheryl appeared in the dining room doorway, her face streaked with tears, her body shaking. "She doesn't want the baby," Cheryl said, her voice hollow. "They don't want it anymore." Miles looked at her, at the woman he'd loved, at the ruin her blind loyalty had made of their life. What did she say exactly? Cheryl leaned against the doorframe, as if her legs couldn't quite support her. That they weren't ready. That maybe in a few years they'd try again. A bitter laugh escaped her. "Maybe next time." That's what she said. "Maybe next time. And what about this time?" Miles asked, gesturing to Cheryl's swollen belly. "What about the baby that's coming in 2 months?" Fresh tears spilled down Cheryl's cheeks. She said maybe we could keep it, since we've been married longer, since we have a stable home. Her voice broke, as if it's some kind of favor she's doing us. Miles stood slowly, gathering his blueprints into a neat stack. And what did you say? I told her she couldn't do this, that she couldn't just change her mind now, that there were papers, agreements, which mean nothing if she doesn't want the child, Miles pointed out. No court is going to force her to take a baby she doesn't want. Cheryl stared at him, realization dawning in her eyes. Miles, she said, her voice small and pleading. What are we going to do? Miles looked at her for a long moment, taking in the fear in her eyes, the desperation, the silent plea for him to fix this, to make it right, to pull them back from the edge she'd pushed them to. We, he said finally, emphasizing the word with cold precision, aren't going to do anything. You made this choice, Cheryl, against my explicit warnings, against common sense, against the stability of our marriage. Miles, please, Cheryl begged, tears flowing freely now. I need you. Miles gathered his blueprints and portfolio. You needed me before you destroyed our marriage, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Now, you need someone else. He walked past her to the front door, stopping only to get his keys from the hook. Where are you going? Cheryl asked, panic edging into her voice. Miles turned to look at her one last time, taking in the picture she made standing in the doorway of the home he'd built for them, carrying a child that wasn't theirs, tears streaming down her face as her carefully constructed illusion crumbled around her. Not my baby, he said quietly. Not my problem. The door closed behind him with a final click. The next 2 months passed in a blur of calculated decisions and cold distance. Miles had moved out of their shared home the night Delaney dropped her bombshell, taking only what he needed: clothes, important documents, his tools. He'd found a small apartment above one of his renovation projects, bare and functional, just like his current approach to life. He'd gone back to the house once, when he knew Cheryl would be at a doctor's appointment. He'd walked through the rooms with detached efficiency, gathering more of his belongings, personal items he didn't want lost in the inevitable fallout. In the home office, he'd spent an hour going through their financial records, making copies of everything. That was the thing about betrayal. Once you'd seen it once, you started looking for it everywhere. It was a Tuesday morning when his phone rang, the screen displaying Sandra's name. He almost didn't answer, but something, perhaps the remnants of the man he'd been before all this, made him press the green button. Hello, Sandra, he said, his voice neutral. Miles. Her voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. We need to talk. In person. I'm in the middle of a project. Make time, Sandra snapped. This is about your wife and your marriage. Ex-wife, soon enough, Miles corrected her. And I didn't destroy the marriage. Cheryl did that all on her own. Sandra made a sound of frustration. Frank and I are coming to your job site. Today, at noon. Be there. She hung up before he could respond. Miles slid the phone back in his pocket and returned to the kitchen renovation he was overseeing. He lost himself in the work, the precise measurements, the clean lines, the predictable behavior of wood and stone. When noon approached, he didn't make any special preparations. Let them come. He had nothing to hide and nothing to apologize for. A T12 Sharp, a silver SUV, pulled up to the curb. Sandra and Frank emerged, both wearing expressions that might have intimidated a lesser man. Miles wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to meet them in the front yard. Sandra, Frank, he greeted them with a nod. Is there somewhere we can talk privately? Frank asked, glancing at the workers moving in and out of the house. Miles led them to his truck, parked under a large oak tree at the edge of the property. He leaned against the driver's side door, arms crossed, waiting. Sandra spoke first, her voice vibrating with emotion. Cheryl is 9 months pregnant, Miles. 9 months, and you've abandoned her. Cheryl made a choice, Miles replied evenly. Against my explicit warning. She chose her sister over our marriage. I simply acknowledged that choice. She made a mistake, Sandra exclaimed. People make mistakes. Some mistakes can't be undone, Miles said. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. Frank stepped closer, using his slight height advantage to look down at Miles. Marriage is about forgiveness, son. About sticking together through thick and thin. Marriage is about partnership, Miles countered. About making major life decisions together. About respecting boundaries. Cheryl failed on all counts. So you're punishing her, Sandra accused, her eyes flashing. That's cruel, Miles. Beneath the man we thought you were. Miles didn't flinch. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm protecting myself from further harm. There's a difference. The baby is coming any day now, Frank said, his voice softening slightly. Cheryl is terrified. Delaney and Jack have completely ghosted her. She needs you. She needed me before she destroyed our marriage, Miles replied, the words familiar on his tongue. Now, she needs someone else. Sandra took a step forward, her finger jabbing the air between them. Be a man, Miles. Step up. This innocent child did nothing wrong. You're right, Miles agreed. The child did nothing wrong. Neither did I. Cheryl, Delaney, and Jack are the ones who created this situation. Let them handle it. So that's it, Frank asked, incredulity creeping into his voice. You're just walking away? 7 years of marriage, down the drain? I didn't walk away, Miles corrected him. I was pushed. And yes, that's it. I've already contacted a lawyer. The divorce papers will be ready by the end of the week. Sandra's face flushed with anger. You've changed, Miles. You used to be a good man. I'm still the same man I've always been, Miles said, with the same principles and the same boundaries. The only difference is now you're seeing what happens when those boundaries are crossed. You'll regret this, Frank warned. When you're old and alone, you'll look back on this moment and realize what you threw away. Miles pushed off from the truck and straightened, done with the conversation. What was thrown away wasn't my decision. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. He walked back toward the house without looking back. He could feel their eyes boring into him, their disappointment and anger radiating like heat. He didn't care. Their opinion of him had never been his concern, even when things were good. That evening, he met with his lawyer, a shrewd woman named Rita Patel who specialized in high-conflict divorces. He'd hired her the day after he moved out, another calculated move in what was becoming a chess game of self-preservation. Your in-laws paid you a visit? Rita asked, eyebrows raised. Miles nodded. They seemed to think guilt might succeed where manipulation failed. And did it? No. Rita smiled thinly. Good, because from a legal standpoint, you're in a strong position. You didn't abandon the marital home due to any wrongdoing on your part. You left after a significant breach of trust that fundamentally altered the marriage. What's our next move? Miles asked, leaning forward in his chair. Rita opened a folder on her desk. We need to protect your assets. You mentioned your wife isn't working currently due to the pregnancy. That's right. And whose name is on the house? Both of ours. Rita made a note. The business. Mine alone. I started it before we were married. Good. She looked up. I suggest we move quickly on separating finances. Joint bank accounts, shared credit cards, vehicles titled in both names, all of it. Miles nodded. I'll handle it tomorrow. One more thing, Rita said, her expression serious. Her family seems determined to paint you as the villain here. Be prepared for that narrative to continue. It might get ugly. I'm counting on it, Miles replied. People show their true colors when they're desperate. The next day, Miles systematically dismantled the financial connections between himself and Cheryl. He went to their bank and withdrew exactly half of their joint savings, opening a new account at a different bank. He contacted their credit card companies and removed himself as an authorized user from Cheryl's cards and vice versa. He went to the DMV and transferred the title of their shared SUV solely to his name, then drove to a dealership and sold it, depositing the money into his new account. With each action, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and grief. This was the practical undoing of 7 years together, reduced to signatures and account numbers. His phone rang several times throughout the day. Cheryl, her parents, even a number he didn't recognize but suspected might be Jack or Delaney. He ignored them all. There was nothing left to say. That night, as he sat in his sparse apartment reviewing paperwork, his phone pinged with a text from Frank. Cheryl's in labor. Good Hope Hospital. Miles stared at the message for a long moment. Something twisted in his gut, not regret. Exactly, but a distant echo of what might have been. In another life, in another version of this story, he might have been racing to the hospital, heart pounding with excitement and fear, ready to welcome his child into the world. But this wasn't his child. and Cheryl wasn't his wife. Not in any way that mattered anymore. That he set the phone down without replying and returned to his paperwork. 3 days passed before Miles heard anything more. He'd thrown himself into work, staying at job sites until well after dark, driving his crew harder than usual. If they noticed his increased intensity, they were smart enough not to mention it. He was at the lumber yard selecting materials for a new project when his phone buzzed with a text from Rita. Need to meet. Important development. My office, 2 p.m. Miles arrived at the lawyer's office precisely on time, a habit ingrained in him since childhood. Rita ushered him in immediately, closing the door behind them for privacy. There's been a complication, she said without preamble. The baby was born 3 days ago. A boy, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Miles nodded, unsurprised by the news. And Delaney and Jack are refusing to sign the birth certificate or any paperwork acknowledging the child is theirs. Rita watched him carefully. According to my sources, Delaney hasn't even visited the hospital. Jack has blocked Cheryl's number. As predicted, Miles said quietly. Yes, well, here's where it affects you, Rita continued. If no one claims paternity, and given that Cheryl is the birth mother, the child is legally hers, Miles finished. And since we're still legally married, exactly, Rita nodded. You could be considered the legal father by default, especially in a state that presumes a husband is the father of any child born during the marriage. Miles leaned back in his chair, a cold anger settling in his bones. That's why you called me in? Because they're trying to trap me with legal responsibility for a child I explicitly warned Cheryl I wanted no part of. Essentially, yes, Rita admitted. But we have options. Given the circumstances, the surrogacy agreement, the clear understanding between all parties, we can fight this. It will just be messier than we anticipated. Messier means more expensive, Miles observed. Unfortunately, yes. But from what you've told me about your financial situation, that shouldn't be a problem. It's not, Miles confirmed. Do what needs to be done. I want those divorce papers ready as soon as possible. Rita made a note. There's one more thing you should know. Your mother-in-law called my office this morning. She was quite insistent about reaching you. I'm sure she was, Miles said dryly. Did she mention why? Just that it was urgent family business that couldn't be discussed over the phone. Miles stood, straightening his jacket. Everything can be discussed over the phone these days. They just want to try to manipulate me in person again. Rita rose as well. Miles, I understand your position, but tread carefully. Courts don't look kindly on spouses who appear completely uncompromising, especially when children are involved, even children that aren't biologically theirs. I'm not being uncompromising, Miles said, his voice hard. I'm standing by the boundaries I set from the beginning. Cheryl knew exactly what would happen if she went through with this surrogacy. So did her family. They just didn't believe me. That's their mistake, Rita acknowledged. But make sure it doesn't become yours too. Miles left the office with Rita's warning echoing in his mind. He knew she was right. He needed to be strategic, not just reactive. The emotional satisfaction of shutting Cheryl and her family out completely might feel good in the moment, but could backfire legally. As he drove back to his apartment, his phone rang. Cheryl's name flashed on the screen. After a moment's hesitation, he answered and put it on speaker. Miles. Her voice was thin, exhausted. Please don't hang up. I'm listening, he said, keeping his tone neutral. I'm being discharged tomorrow, she said. With the baby. I don't know what to do, Miles. My parents say they can't take us in. They're too old, they say. The stairs in their house, the late nights. Her voice broke. Delaney won't answer my calls. Jack has blocked me. I have nowhere to go. Miles stopped at a red light, staring straight ahead. What about the house? Our house. The mortgage payment is due next week, Cheryl said, a note of panic entering her voice. You know, I don't have that kind of money right now. And I can't go back to work, not with a newborn. Not when I'm still recovering from a birth. The light turned green. Miles pressed the accelerator gently. What exactly are you asking for, Cheryl? There was a pause, filled only with the sound of her shaky breathing. I need help, she finally said, the words seeming to cost her something. I made a mistake, Miles. A terrible mistake. I see that now. Please, I need you. Miles pulled into a gas station parking lot, and stopped the car, needing to focus fully on this conversation. "You needed me before you destroyed our marriage," he said, the familiar refrain tasting bitter on his tongue. "Now, you need someone else. There is no one else." Cheryl cried, desperation clear in her voice. "You're my husband. We took vows. For better or worse, remember?" "I remember," Miles said quietly. "I also remember warning you exactly what would happen if you went through with the surrogacy. You made your choice, Cheryl. Now live with it. What am I supposed to do with a baby?" Cheryl asked, her voice cracking. "How am I supposed to support him?" "That's a question you should have asked before you agreed to be a surrogate for your sister," Miles pointed out. "Before you put her wants above our marriage." There was a long silence. "Then, will you at least come see me? Before I leave the hospital? We could talk face to face." Miles considered the request. Part of him, the part that still remembered the good years, the love they'd shared, wanted to go to her, to see for himself that she was all right. But the larger part, the part shaped by betrayal and cold reality, knew better. "I'll come tomorrow," he said finally. 10 a.m. "And Cheryl?" "I'll be bringing the divorce papers." He ended the call before she could respond. The next morning, Miles arrived at Good Hope Hospital exactly at 10. He carried a manila envelope containing the divorce papers Rita had prepared. He found Cheryl's room easily enough, pausing outside the door to gather himself before knocking softly and entering. The sight that greeted him was both foreign and painfully familiar. Cheryl sat in a chair by the window, a small bundle wrapped in blue held against her chest. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. But there was something else there, too, a fierce protectiveness, as she looked down at the infant in her arms. She glanced up when Miles entered, hope flaring briefly in her eyes before dimming at the sight of the envelope in his hand. "You came," she said, her voice small. "I said I would." Miles remained standing near the door, maintaining his distance. "How are you feeling? Physically?" "Sore. Tired." Cheryl adjusted the baby in her arms. "Emotionally?" "Terrified." Miles nodded, unsurprised by her answer. "The baby seems healthy." "Yes. Perfect, actually." A ghost of a smile touched her lips as she looked down at the infant. "They say he has my eyes." Miles felt a twinge of something not quite regret, not quite sorrow, but he pushed it aside. "Cheryl," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "we need to discuss what happens now." She looked up, tears gathering in her eyes. "I know what those papers are, Miles. But before you give them to me, please just listen. I made a terrible mistake. I see that now. Delaney used me. She never intended to take this baby. She didn't want to see how far she could push me, how much she could control me." Her voice broke. "And I let her. I chose her over you, over us. And I will regret that for the rest of my life." Miles stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air between them. "But this baby," Cheryl continued, looking down at the sleeping infant, "he's innocent in all this. He didn't ask to be born into this mess. And now he has no one except me. And I have no one." She looked up at Miles, naked hope in her eyes. "Except maybe you? If you could find it in your heart to forgive me, to give us another chance." Miles took a deep breath, steeling himself against the pull of her plea. "Cheryl, I want to be very clear. I don't blame the baby. As you said, he's innocent in all this. But that doesn't change what happened between us. You betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way. You put your sister's wants above our marriage, above my clearly stated boundaries." "I know," Cheryl whispered. "And I'm sorry. So sorry." "Sorry doesn't rebuild trust," Miles said. "Sorry doesn't erase what happened." He stepped forward and placed the envelope on the foot of the hospital bed. "These are divorce papers. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. The house will be sold, and the proceeds split equally. Same with any other shared assets." Cheryl stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. "Just like that? 7 years, over?" "It was over the moment you said my body, my choice, without considering what that choice would do to us," Miles replied. "This is just making it official." "And what am I supposed to do?" Cheryl asked, a hint of anger finally breaking through her desperation. "Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to raise a baby alone?" Miles met her gaze steadily. "Those are questions you should have asked before making your decision. I can't solve those problems for you, Cheryl. Not anymore. So you're just going to walk away? Leave me with nothing. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You won't have nothing, Miles corrected her. You'll have half of our assets once the divorce is final. Until then, I'll continue to pay my share of the mortgage. After that, what you do is up to you. Cheryl looked down at the baby, then back at Miles. I still love you, she said softly. I never stopped. Doesn't that count for anything? Miles felt a familiar ache in his chest, the ghost of what they once had. Love without respect, without trust, without boundaries. That's not love, Cheryl. That's just need. And I deserve more than that. So do you? He turned to leave, pausing at the door. I'll call you in a few days about listing the house. In the meantime, you should sign those papers and find a lawyer. This doesn't have to be any harder than it already is. He walked out without looking back, the sound of Cheryl's quiet sobs following him down the hall. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of legal maneuvers and calculated distance. Miles threw himself into work, taking on more projects than usual, staying busy from dawn until well after dark. When he did allow himself downtime, he spent it planning, strategizing with Rita, making sure every possible angle was covered. Cheryl had returned to their house with the baby, a fact that spiked Miles' irritation, but that Rita assured him couldn't be prevented until the divorce was finalized. She had named the boy Ethan, according to the paperwork that now littered Rita's desk. She had also, eventually, signed the divorce papers, though her lawyer had added several requests. Alimony, continued health insurance coverage, sole possession of the house. Rita had rejected them all. We need to gather more information, Rita said during one of their meetings. Specifically about the surrogacy arrangement. Was there money involved? Often, commercial surrogacy involved compensation. Miles frowned. Cheryl never mentioned being paid. Did you ask? No, Miles admitted. I assumed she was doing it out of some misguided sense of family loyalty. Rita made note. I'll request financial records as part of discovery. Bank statements, tax returns, the works. If there was money changing hands, we should be able to find it. 2 days later, Rita called Miles as he was driving between job sites. You need to come to my office, she said, an unusual tension in her voice. Now, when Miles arrived, Rita was waiting with a stack of papers on her desk. We found something, she said without preamble. Several somethings, actually. She pushed a bank statement toward him. Miles scanned it, his eye catching on a deposit for $20,000 dated about a month after Cheryl had agreed to the surrogacy. Is that, he began. From Jack Whitaker's business account, Rita confirmed. And there's more. She slid over another statement showing a deposit of $15,000 a few months later. This one's from Delaney. Miles felt a cold fury building inside him. She was paid for the surrogacy, and she never told me. Not only that, Rita continued, but she deposited these funds into a separate account, one you weren't aware of. She handed him another document. An account opened 6 months ago, in her name only. Miles stared at the paper, the betrayal cutting fresh and deep. Financial infidelity, he said quietly. Exactly. Rita looked satisfied. This changes things, Miles. Significantly. Courts take financial dishonesty very seriously in divorce proceedings. What does this mean for the divorce? Miles asked, his mind already racing ahead. It means we can argue for a much more favorable division of assets, Rita explained. Given that she concealed income and established secret accounts during the marriage, we can make a case that she shouldn't be entitled to an equal split of marital assets. Miles nodded slowly. Do it. The following week, they presented their findings to the judge overseeing the divorce proceedings. Miles sat stoically as Rita laid out the evidence of Cheryl's financial deception, her secret bank account, the substantial sums she'd received and hidden. Across the courtroom, Cheryl's face crumpled as the truth was exposed. Her lawyer, a young man who seemed increasingly out of his depth, tried to argue that the money had been meant to cover medical expenses and lost wages during the pregnancy. But the timing of the deposits, combined with the fact that Cheryl had deliberately concealed them, undercut his argument. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, listened to both sides before delivering her ruling. Given the evidence of financial concealment and the establishment of separate accounts without disclosure to the spouse, I am inclined to grant Mr. Vance's petition for a greater share of the marital assets." She continued, outlining her decision. Miles would retain full ownership of his business. The house would be sold, but with 70% of the proceeds going to Miles, and all joint accounts will be divided with the same 70/30ths split in Miles' favor. Cheryl would retain her personal belongings and her secret account, but would receive no alimony. As they left the courtroom, Miles caught Cheryl's tear-filled gaze. She looked broken, devastated. For a brief moment, he almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. You were paid," he said quietly as they passed each other in the hallway. "You were paid to betray me. Even better." Cheryl flinched as if he'd slapped her. "It wasn't like that," she whispered. "It was exactly like that," Miles replied. "And now everyone knows it." He walked away, back straight, head high. One more piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. One more confirmation that he'd been right all along. But he wasn't finished yet. That evening, Miles sat in his apartment, scrolling through his phone contacts until he found a name he hadn't thought about in years. Robert Kessler, Delaney's first ex-husband. Miles had met him only once, at a holiday gathering years ago before Delaney had divorced him. He'd seemed like a decent man, quiet but sharp-eyed, watching Delaney's dramatic performances with a resignation that suggested he'd seen it all before. Miles pressed the call button before he could reconsider. "Hello." The voice on the other end was cautious, as one might expect from an unexpected call from a number not in their contacts. "Robert? This is Miles Vance. Cheryl's husband, well, soon-to-be ex-husband. We met once at Frank and Sandra's Christmas party about 5 years ago." There was a pause. "Miles." "Yes, I remember. What can I do for you?" "I have some information you might find interesting," Miles said carefully. "About Delaney and her latest scheme." Robert's laugh was short and without humor. "Which one?" "That woman has more schemes than a pyramid marketer." "This one involves a baby," Miles said. "A surrogate baby, to be precise. My wife's baby." There was a long silence on the other end. "You'd better start from the beginning," Robert finally said. Miles laid it all out: Delaney's manipulation of Cheryl, the surrogacy, the abandonment of the baby after birth, the financial payments. As he spoke, he could hear Robert's breathing growing more agitated. "That sounds exactly like her," Robert said when Miles finished. "Use people until they're no longer useful, then discard them. But this, using her own sister like this, abandoning a child, that's low even for Delaney." "I thought you should know," Miles said, "especially since I understand you're an attorney." "Family law, yes." "Then perhaps you might have some insight into what Delaney's legal obligations might be here," Miles suggested. "Toward the child she commissioned, then abandoned." There was another pause, longer this time. "I might," Robert said slowly. "In fact, I might have quite a lot of insight. And contacts. And a very personal interest in seeing Delaney face consequences for once in her life." Miles felt the first genuine smile in months tug at his lips. "I was hoping you'd say that." 2 days later, Delaney received official notice of a petition for child support, naming her and Jack as the legal parents of Ethan based on the surrogacy arrangement, the financial payments made to Cheryl, and their explicit intention to create a child. Robert had moved quickly, leveraging his contacts in the family court system to expedite the process. Miles heard about the fallout through Sandra, who called him in a fury. "What have you done?" she demanded. "Delaney is beside herself. They're saying she owes thousands in child support for a baby she didn't even give birth to. A baby she paid to have created," Miles corrected calmly. "A baby she intended to parent until it became inconvenient. Actions have consequences, Sandra, even for Delaney." "This is revenge," Sandra accused. "Pure and simple." "No," Miles disagreed. "This is justice. For the child who deserves support from the people who brought him into this world. For Cheryl, who was used and discarded. And yes, for me, whose marriage was destroyed by your daughter's selfishness." "Cheryl will never forgive you for this," Sandra warned. Miles laughed softly. "That's the beauty of it, Sandra. I don't need her forgiveness. Just like she didn't need my approval when she made her choice." He ended the call, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. The pieces were all in place now. Cheryl was financially ruined. facing the reality of single motherhood with limited resources. Delaney was legally obligated to pay child support, her lavish lifestyle threatened by monthly payments for a child she'd wanted only as an accessory. Jack had vanished, running from responsibility as Miles had predicted from start. And Miles? Miles would walk away with his finances intact, his business thriving, and his conscience clear. He had warned them. He had drawn his line in the sand. They had crossed it anyway, convinced he would eventually cave, eventually forgive. They had been wronged as he looked around his sparse apartment. Miles felt no regret, no second thoughts. Only a cold certainty that he had done exactly what he'd said he would do. He had stood by his principles, protected himself, and allowed those who had betrayed him to face the natural consequences of their actions. Not his baby. Not his problem. The phrase that had started as a warning had become his mantra, his justification, his truth. And he would not look back. 6 months had passed since the divorce was finalized. Miles stood in the empty office space that would soon become the new headquarters for Vance Renovations. The business had grown beyond his initial expectations, with 3 full crews now working under him and a steady stream of high-end clients seeking his reputation for quality and reliability. He walked the perimeter of the room, measuring tape in hand, making notes on a small pad. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting geometric patterns on the hardwood floors. He had plans for this place, a professional reception area, a design studio where clients could visualize their projects, private offices for himself and the project managers he planned to hire. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Rita. Thought you'd want to know. House sold. Closing next week. Miles typed a short reply. Good. The house, his and Cheryl's house, had been on the market for 4 months. The real estate market had softened, but the property had finally attracted a buyer willing to pay a fair price. As per the divorce settlement, Miles would receive 70% of the proceeds, another financial victory to add to his growing list. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Rita. Also, Foster missed second child support payment. Court proceedings initiated. Miles allowed himself a small smile. Delaney's financial troubles had begun almost immediately after the court had ordered her to pay child support. Her lifestyle, the expensive clothes, the lavish trips, the upscale apartment had quickly become unsustainable under the weight of the monthly payments. According to Rita's sources, she'd already been forced to downsize to a smaller apartment and sell her luxury car. Justice, Miles thought. Slow but inevitable. He pocketed his phone and continued his inspection of the new office space. He had a meeting with the contractor in 20 minutes to discuss the renovation timeline. The doorbell jangled as someone entered the empty space. Miles turned, expecting to see the contractor, but instead found Frank Foster standing awkwardly in the doorway. Frank, Miles said, his voice neutral. This is unexpected. Frank looked older than the last time Miles had seen him. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his shoulders seemed to slump under an invisible weight. I was driving by, Frank said, though Miles doubted that was true. The office was in a commercial district, well away from Frank's usual haunts. Saw your truck outside. Miles set down his measuring tape. What can I do for you? Frank took a few steps into the room, glancing around at the bare walls and empty space. Business doing well. Very well, Miles confirmed. Frank nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected. And you? You're doing well too, I take it. I am. Miles crossed his arms, waiting for whatever was coming next. Frank hadn't sought him out for small talk. That's good. Frank looked down at his shoes. That's good for you. Frank, Miles said, his patience wearing thin. Why are you here? Frank looked up, a flash of the old stubbornness crossing his face. Cheryl had to move in with us. Miles kept his expression neutral. I'm aware. After the house sold, she couldn't afford a place on her own. Not with the baby. Not with no job. That was always a possibility, Miles pointed out. One she should have considered before making her choice. Frank's face reddened slightly. She's struggling, Miles. Really struggling. The baby keeps her up all night. She can't find work that pays enough to cover childcare. And our place isn't set up for a baby. Sandra and I are too old to be getting up at all hours. I'm sorry to hear that, Miles said, his tone making it clear that his sympathy was limited. But I'm not sure what this has to do with me. She was your wife for 7 years, Frank said, an edge entering his voice. Don't you care at all what happens to her? Miles considered the question. Did he care? On some level, yes. Cheryl had been a significant part of his life. He'd love her once, deeply, but that love had died the day she'd chosen her sister over their marriage, chosen a surrogate baby over his clearly stated boundaries. I care enough to hope she learns from this, Miles said finally, but not enough to fix problems of her own creation. Frank shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. You're a cold man, Miles Vance. I'm a logical man, Miles corrected. Actions have consequences. Choices have costs. Cheryl made her choice. Now she's paying the cost. That's not coldness. That's reality. Reality, Frank repeated bitterly. You know what reality is? Reality is my daughter crying herself to sleep every night. Reality is a baby who needs things we can barely afford. Reality is Delaney refusing to even see her sister, let alone help with the child she wanted so badly. All predictable outcomes, Miles said. All things I warned Cheryl about before she decided to go through with the surrogacy. Frank stepped closer, anger flashing in his eyes. You set this up, didn't you? Getting Delaney on the hook for child support? Making sure Cheryl got next to nothing in the divorce? This is all some elaborate revenge plot. No, Miles said calmly. This is justice. Delaney should pay child support for a child she commissioned. Cheryl should face consequences for financial deception during our marriage. And I should be allowed to move on with my life without carrying the burdens of other people's poor decisions. She still loves you, Frank said, his voice dropping. Despite everything, she still loves you. Something twisted in Miles' chest, not regret, not longing, but a distant echo of what might have been. Love isn't enough, Frank. It never was. Frank stared at him for a long moment, then turned toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob. You know what Sandra says? She says you're the worst thing that ever happened to our family. But I think that's wrong. I think Cheryl choosing you in the first place might have been the worst decision she ever made. Miles watched him leave, the door closing firmly behind him. The words should have stung, but instead, they simply confirmed what he already knew. Cheryl's family would never accept their role in what had happened. They would always see him as the villain rather than face their own culpability. He returned to his measurements, pushing the encounter from his mind. He had work to do, a business to run, a future to build. Frank's visit was just another remnant of a past he was steadily leaving behind. Later that week, Miles was reviewing applications for a new project manager position when his phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but some instinct made him press the green button. Miles Vance. Miles. Cheryl's voice. Soft, uncertain. Please don't hang up. He said nothing, waiting. I heard the house sold. She continued when the silence stretched. I guess that's it then. The last tie. Yes, Miles agreed. The last tie. I saw you, Cheryl said suddenly. Last week. At Morrison's Cafe. Through the window. You were with someone. Miles closed his eyes briefly. He had been at Morrison's, having lunch with Abigail Chun, an interior designer he'd been collaborating with on several projects. The lunch had been primarily professional, though there had been moments of personal connection that had surprised and intrigued him. Yes, he said, offering nothing more. You were smiling, Cheryl continued, her voice tight with something that might have been pain. Laughing. You looked happy. I am happy, Miles said simply that a soft sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. I know I don't deserve it, but I miss you. I still love you. Miles leaned back in his chair, a cold anger settling in his bones. Love? He repeated, the word sharp on his tongue. You killed at the moment you said, my body, my choice. Funny how that didn't apply when you needed me. Huh? Silence stretched between them, taut and heavy. I made a mistake, Cheryl whispered finally. No, Miles corrected her. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. What you did was a choice. A deliberate decision to put your sister's wants above our marriage. Above my clearly stated boundaries. So that's it. No forgiveness? No second chance. There's forgiveness, Miles said, his voice softening a fraction. "I forgive you enough to wish you well, to hope you find happiness someday. But that doesn't mean reconciliation. That doesn't mean erasing what happened. Miles, please. Goodbye, Cheryl." He ended the call, set the phone down carefully on his desk, and returned to the applications in front of him. The conversation had left him unsettled, not because he doubted his decision, but because he recognized in Cheryl's voice the desperate hope that time might have softened his resolve. It hadn't. If anything, time had only hardened his conviction that he'd made the right choice in walking away. His phone pinged with a text. Robert Kessler. Delaney served with papers for contempt. Missed third payment. Court date set for next month. Miles texted back a simple, "Thanks for the update," and pocketed the phone. Everything was proceeding exactly as he'd predicted. Cheryl struggling financially, emotionally, practically. Delaney facing legal consequences for her selfishness. Jack nowhere to be found, having vanished as easily as he'd appeared in their lives. And Miles? Miles was thriving. His business expanding, his finances secure, his conscience clear. He had warned them. He had drawn his line in the sand. They had crossed it anyway. Not his baby, not his problem. The autumn air carried a crisp promise of change as Miles locked up the new Vance Renovations office for the night. The renovation had been completed 2 weeks earlier, transforming the empty space into a sleek, professional environment that reflected the growing success of his business. That he checked his watch. 7:30. He still had time to go home and change before meeting Abigail for dinner at 8:30. What had begun as professional collaboration had gradually evolved into something more personal over the past few months. Miles had been cautious, wary of opening himself up to potential hurt again, but Abigail's straightforward nature and clear respect for boundaries had slowly worn down his defenses. As he walked to his truck, his phone rang. "Rita." "Good evening, Rita," he answered, unlocking the vehicle and sliding behind the wheel. "Evening, Miles." Rita's voice was brisk as always. "Just thought you'd want to know the latest. Delaney Foster appeared in court today for the contempt hearing." Miles started the engine, but remained parked. And the judge was not impressed with her excuses. "She's been ordered to pay the arrears immediately, plus a fine. If she misses another payment, there could be wage garnishment." "Interesting," Miles said, "considering she hasn't held a steady job in years." "Exactly," Rita agreed, which is why the judge also ordered an accounting of her assets. "Seems he suspects she might be hiding money." Miles allowed himself a small smile. "Is she?" "Oh, almost certainly," Rita said with a dry laugh. "But she's not as clever as she thinks. The forensic accountant the court appointed will find whatever she's squirreled away." "Good to know," Miles said. "Anything else?" "Just one thing." Rita's voice took on a more personal tone. "You sound better, Miles. More at peace." Miles considered this. "I am," he admitted. "Life is simpler when you cut out toxic influences." "Speaking of which," Rita continued, "I ran into Cheryl yesterday at the courthouse. She was filing paperwork for public assistance." Miles felt a twinge of something. Not quite guilt, not quite satisfaction. "I see. She looked rough," Rita said bluntly. "Tired, stressed. Had the baby with her cute kid, for what it's worth." "She asked about you." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're doing well. That your business is thriving. That you've moved on." Miles nodded, though Rita couldn't see him. "Thank you. She tried to give me a letter for you," Rita continued. "I declined. Told her if she needed to communicate with you for legal reasons, it should go through proper channels." "Good," Miles said. He glanced at his watch again. "I appreciate the update, Rita, but I need to get going. I have dinner plans." "With the designer?" Rita asked, a hint of approval in her voice. "Good for you, Miles. About time you started living for yourself again." After ending the call, Miles drove home, showered, and changed into dark slacks and a charcoal button-down. Abigail had suggested a new restaurant in the upscale part of town, a place that had opened after his separation from Cheryl. A new experience, unmarked by past associations. That was part of what he appreciated about Abigail, her intuitive understanding of his need for fresh starts, clean breaks. The restaurant was elegant without being pretentious, with warm lighting and comfortable seating. Abigail was already there when he arrived, wearing a simple black dress that flattered her slender frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, emphasizing her strong jawline and bright, intelligent eyes. "Sorry I'm late," Miles said, sliding into the seat across from her. "You're not," Abigail replied with a smile, checking her watch. 8:29. By most standards, that's early. Miles felt himself relax. This was another thing he appreciated about Abigail, her precision, her attention to detail. It matched his own approach to life. "How was your day?" he asked, opening the menu. "Productive," Abigail said. "Finalized the design for the Henderson project, met with 2 potential new clients, and managed to squeeze in a yoga class." "Impressive," Miles said with genuine admiration. "And yours?" "Similar. Hired a new project manager, finalized permits for the lakeside renovation, and got an update on some ongoing legal matters." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Legal matters? Sounds ominous." Miles considered how much to share. He'd been deliberately vague about his divorce and its messy aftermath, not wanting to burden a new relationship with old baggage. But Abigail had proven herself trustworthy, and there was something liberating about the idea of being completely honest with someone again. "The aftermath of my divorce," he said finally. "Some loose ends being tied up." Abigail nodded, her expression neither prying nor dismissive. "I suspected as much. You have that look when you mention it, like you're walking through a minefield of memories." Miles felt a smile tug at his lips. "That's a surprisingly accurate description. I'm a designer," Abigail said with a shrug. "I noticed details." They ordered Miles a steak, Abigail the fish, and fell into easy conversation about work, mutual acquaintances, a recent book they'd both read. It was comfortable, engaging, devoid of the emotional manipulation Miles had grown accustomed to in his marriage's final months. "Can I ask you something personal?" Abigail said as they waited for dessert. Miles nodded, curious. "What happened? With your marriage, I mean." She held up a hand. "You don't have to answer. I know it's a lot to ask, but I like you, Miles. I think we could have something real here. And I'd rather know what I'm walking into." Miles considered her question, appreciating the directness. "My ex-wife made a series of choices that betrayed my trust in fundamental ways," he said carefully. "She chose her family's approval over our marriage, even after I made it clear where my boundaries were." Abigail didn't rush to fill the silence that followed, giving him space to continue or not as he chose. "I believe in consequences," Miles went on, "in standing by your principles, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." She didn't share that belief. She thought love meant I would eventually forgive anything, accept anything, tolerate any betrayal. "And you don't believe that," Abigail observed. "No," Miles agreed. "I don't. Love without respect, without boundaries, isn't love. It's just need disguised as affection." Abigail nodded slowly. "I can understand that. My last relationship ended because he couldn't understand why I wouldn't loan him money for his 3rd guaranteed successful business venture." She smiled ruefully. "I believe in second chances, not 3rd and 4th ones." "Exactly," Miles said, feeling a surge of connection. This woman understood, truly understood, in a way Cheryl never had. They finished dinner and walked to the parking lot together. As they reached Abigail's car, she turned to face him. "I had a lovely evening," she said. "So did I," Miles replied. She studied his face for a moment, then stepped closer. "I'm going to kiss you now," she said matter-of-factly. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." Miles felt a genuine laugh escape him, the first and longer than he could remember. "I'd rather you did," he admitted. The kiss was brief but warm, a promise of possibilities rather than a demand for commitment. When they parted, Abigail smiled up at him. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said. "I have some ideas for the Robertson project we should discuss." "I look forward to it," Miles replied, meaning every word as he drove home. Miles felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. That seemed too simple a word for the complex blend of satisfaction, cautious optimism, and quiet pride he felt. But contentment, yes. A sense that his life was proceeding on the right track, that the painful decisions he'd made had led him to a better place, He was nearly home when he spotted a familiar figure walking along the sidewalk in the dim evening light. Cheryl, pushing a stroller with one hand, struggling with a grocery bag in the other. She lived with her parents now, Miles knew. In the same neighborhood where he'd rented his apartment after moving out of their house, he slowed his truck, a brief internal debate raging. Should he stop? Offer help? Drive on? Before he could decide, Cheryl looked up, her gaze finding his through the windshield. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by a complex mix of emotions. Hope, shame, longing, fear. She stopped walking, the stroller halting beside her. Miles pulled over, rolling down his passenger window as Cheryl approached cautiously. "Miles," she said, her voice soft with surprise. "I didn't know you lived around here." "Just for now," Miles replied. "I'm closing on a new place next month." Cheryl nodded, her eyes taking in his appearance. The nice clothes, the fresh haircut, the lack of tension in his face. "You look good," she said finally. "Thank you," Miles said, neutral but not unkind. "Do you need a ride?" "It's getting dark." Cheryl glanced at the stroller, then the grocery bag. "I'm okay. It's not far." Miles nodded, accepting her decision. "How are you?" he asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. "Managing," Cheryl said, a forced brightness in her voice. "Day by day, you know." "Ethan's walking now, starting to say a few words." "That's good," Miles said. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with all the things they'd once shared and everything that now divided them. "I should go," Cheryl said finally. "My mom's expecting us for dinner." "Of course." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you happy, Miles?" He considered the question, the same one she'd asked on the phone months earlier. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." Something flashed in her eyes, pain, regret, resignation. "I'm glad," she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. "You deserve to be happy." Miles said nothing, knowing any response would only prolong an encounter better kept brief. "Goodbye, Miles," Cheryl said, stepping back from the truck. "Goodbye, Cheryl." He drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror to see her standing there, watching him go, the stroller beside her, the grocery bag at her feet. A tableau of the life he'd left behind, growing smaller and less distinct with every foot of distance he put between them. Miles didn't look back again. His focus was ahead. On the future he was building brick by careful brick. A future without the chaos of Cheryl's family, without the betrayal of broken trust, without the burden of carrying other people's poor decisions. His phone buzzed with a text from Abigail. "Thanks for dinner. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow." Miles smiled, a genuine expression of contentment. Yes, he was happy. Happier than he'd been in the final years of his marriage, certainly. Happiness built on solid ground rather than shifting sand. 3 months later, Miles stood in the empty living room of his new house, surveying the space with satisfaction. The property was larger than the home he'd shared with Cheryl, situated on a quiet street with mature trees and respectful neighbors. He'd closed on it 2 weeks earlier and had spent every spare moment since then making it his own fresh paint in the bedrooms, new fixtures in the bathrooms, refinished hardwood floors throughout. Abigail had helped with the design aspects, her professional eye bringing a cohesion to the space that matched Miles' preference for clean lines and functional beauty. Their relationship had deepened over the past months, evolving into something that, while not yet defined as love, contained all the elements Miles valued. Respect, honesty, shared values, clear boundaries. His phone rang. "Rita again," Miles answered, setting down the paint roller he'd been using on the dining room wall. "Rita, what's the latest?" "Final update," Rita said, her voice holding a note of satisfaction. "Delaney Foster has been ordered to liquidate assets to cover the child support arrears. Seems she had quite a bit tucked away in various accounts. The forensic accountant found it all." Miles nodded to himself. As expected, she tried to argue that the surrogacy agreement wasn't valid since she never signed the final paperwork, Rita continued. The judge wasn't impressed. Given the financial transactions and the clear intent demonstrated in text messages and emails, he ruled that she is legally responsible for support. "Good," Miles said. "Anything else?" "Yes, actually. I received a rather interesting call from Jack Whitaker yesterday." Miles raised an eyebrow, surprised. Jack, I thought he'd vanished. He resurfaced briefly, Rita explained. Seems he and Delaney have called it quits. Messily, according to him. He reached out because he wanted to clear his conscience about the whole surrogacy situation. Interesting. Miles set down his paint roller and moved to the kitchen for a glass of water. What did he have to say? Quite a lot, actually. Most notably that he never wanted a child in the first place. The entire surrogacy was Delaney's idea, a way to prove her control over her sister. According to Jack, Delaney told him explicitly that she wanted to see how far Cheryl would go to please her. The baby was just a means to that end. Miles felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Not surprised he'd suspected as much all along, but the confirmation of Delaney's manipulation was still infuriating. Did he say anything else? Miles asked. He mentioned that Delaney had planned from the beginning to back out once the baby was born, Rita said, disgust evident in her voice. The whole thing was a power play, Miles. A sick game to prove she could make Cheryl destroy her own marriage for Delaney's amusement. Miles closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this. Did you tell Cheryl? No, Rita said. That's not my place. But Jack said he was going to talk to her directly. Clear the air before he leaves town for good. I see, Miles said, unsure how to feel about this development. On one hand, it vindicated everything he believed about Delaney's character and motives. On the other, the knowledge that Cheryl had been so thoroughly manipulated, so completely used by her own sister, brought no satisfaction. Only a distant, muted sense of tragedy at the waste of it all. Miles, Rita's voice cut through his thoughts. You still there? Yes, he said, refocusing. Thank you for the update. No problem. And Miles, for what it's worth, I think you made the right call. Walking away when you did. Some betrayals can't be undone, no matter what the motivation behind them was. After ending the call, Miles returned to his painting, trying to push the conversation from his mind. The past was the past. He'd built a new life, a better life, free from the toxic dynamics of Cheryl's family. What Jack had revealed changed nothing about Miles' decision to leave, about the fundamental breach of trust that had ended his marriage. And yet, later that evening, as Miles was cleaning his paintbrushes in the utility sink, his doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. Abigail was at a client dinner, and he'd given the painting crew the night off. He wiped his hands on a rag and went to the door, peering through the peephole to see Frank Foster standing on his porch, looking even more worn than the last time Miles had seen him. With a sigh, Miles opened the door. Frank, this is becoming a habit. Frank didn't smile. Can I come in? It's important. Miles hesitated, then stepped aside. Briefly, I'm in the middle of something. Frank entered, glancing around at the half-painted walls and the drop cloths covering the furniture. New place looks good, he said, his tone suggesting the compliment was an afterthought. What do you want, Frank? Miles asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Frank turned to face him, his expression grave. Cheryl knows the truth. About Delaney. About the surrogacy. Miles felt a flicker of surprise. Jack told her, so you knew, Frank said, his eyes narrowing slightly. I found out today, Miles corrected. Rita got a call from Jack. Frank nodded slowly. He came to the house this morning. Told Cheryl everything. How Delaney never intended to take the baby. How the whole thing was just some sick game to see how far Cheryl would go to please her sister. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. It destroyed her, Miles. Completely broke her. Miles leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Frank asked, a hint of the old anger returning. Really? Yes, Miles said, surprising himself with his sincerity. I never wanted Cheryl to be hurt. I just refused to be dragged down with her. Frank looked at him for a long moment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. I misjudged you, didn't I? All these years, I thought you were cold, unfeeling, but you were just clear-eyed. You saw what the rest of us couldn't or wouldn't see. Miles said nothing, waiting for Frank to continue. Sandra and I, Frank went on, his voice rough with emotion, we enabled Delaney. All her life. Made excuses for her. Cleaned up her messes. Told ourselves it was love, but really, it was laziness. It was easier to give in than to hold her accountable. And now? Miles asked. Now. Frank laughed, a bitter sound. Now Delaney is facing wage garnishment and asset seizure. Now she's lost Jack, lost her apartment, lost her lifestyle. Now she's blaming everyone but herself for the mess she's in. And Cheryl. Frank's expression softened slightly. Cheryl is finally seeing the truth. About her sister. About herself. About the choices she made. Miles nodded, uncertain what Frank expected from him. She's asking about you, Frank said after a pause. Not like before, not begging for another chance or pleading for help. Just asking if you're okay, if you're happy. Something twisted in Miles' chest, not regret, not longing, just a distant acknowledgement of what once was. I am, he said simply. I believe you, Frank said. And I think Cheryl needs to know that. Not for her sake, but for her own healing. To know that despite everything, you landed on your feet. That your life wasn't destroyed along with hers. Miles considered this. What exactly are you asking me to do, Frank? Talk to her, Frank said. Just once. Give her the closure she needs to move on. To rebuild her life without the weight of thinking she destroyed yours too. Miles was silent for a long moment, weighing the request. I'll think about it, he said finally. Frank nodded, apparently recognizing this was the most he could hope for. That's all I ask. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Miles, I'm sorry. For not seeing sooner what kind of man you really are. After Frank left, Miles returned to his painting, but his mind kept circling back to their conversation, to the idea of closure, to the possibility of one final conversation with Cheryl, free from the raw emotions of the divorce, from the desperate pleas and bitter accusations. He thought about it for 3 days, turning the idea over in his mind while he painted rooms, arranged furniture, settled into his new home. He discussed it with Abigail one evening as they sat on his newly installed back deck, sharing a bottle of wine. What are you afraid of? She asked, direct as always. Miles considered the question. That she'll see it as an opening, a chance to try again. Abigail nodded thoughtfully. That's a risk, but from what you've told me, she's in a different place now, seeing things more clearly. Maybe, Miles acknowledged. And what about you? Abigail asked, her eyes sharp in the dim light. Are you afraid of how you'll feel? Seeing her again? Miles shook his head. No, that part of my life is over. Completely over. Then maybe you should do it, Abigail suggested. Not for her sake, but for yours. True closure isn't just walking away. It's being able to look back without anger, without hurt. It's freedom. Her words stayed with him. Freedom. That was what he'd sought all along, wasn't it? Freedom from the toxic dynamics of Cheryl's family, from the betrayal of broken trust. He'd achieved that, materially at least. But perhaps there was one more step to complete freedom. The next day, Miles called Frank. I'll meet with her, he said without preamble. Once. At the coffee shop on 3rd Street. Tomorrow at 4. Frank's relief was audible. Thank you, Miles. I'll tell her. The coffee shop was neutral territory, a place Miles had discovered after the divorce, with no associations to his life with Cheryl. He arrived early, selecting a table near the back where they could talk privately. He ordered a black coffee and waited, watching the door with a strange calm. Cheryl arrived precisely at 4, punctual in a way she rarely had been during their marriage. She looked different, thinner, with shorter hair and a wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She spotted him immediately and walked over, her movements careful, deliberate. Miles, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Miles nodded. Frank said it was important to you. Cheryl winced slightly at the implication that it wasn't important to him. Yes, she agreed. It is. A waitress approached, and Cheryl ordered a tea. They sat in silence until it arrived, neither quite ready to begin. How's the baby? Miles asked finally, more to break the tension than from genuine curiosity. Ethan, Cheryl supplied. He's good. Growing fast. Starting to talk more. Miles nodded, unsure what else to say about a child he'd never met and had no connection to. I know why you're here, Cheryl said suddenly, her hands wrapped around her mug. And it's not to make small talk about Ethan. Why am I here then? Miles asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Closure, Cheryl said simply. For both of us. A chance to say what needs to be said without lawyers or family members or the raw emotions of divorce getting in the way. Miles felt a flicker of surprise at her insight. Yes, he agreed. Exactly that. Cheryl took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. I need to say something, and I need you to just listen. No interruptions. Can you do that? Miles nodded, wary but willing. I was wrong, Cheryl began, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. Completely, utterly wrong. Not just about the surrogacy, though that was a terrible mistake, but about our marriage, about what it meant to be partners, about respect and boundaries and trust. She paused, taking a sip of her tea. I put my family, specifically Delaney, above our marriage. I ignored your warnings, your boundaries, your insight. I chose to believe what I wanted to believe rather than what was right in front of me. Her voice cracked slightly, and I lost everything because of it. Miles remained silent, honoring his promise to just listen. Jack told me the truth, Cheryl continued, her voice stronger now. About Delaney, about how she never wanted the baby, how it was all just a game to her, a way to prove her control over me. She shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. And the worst part of me knew. Deep down, I knew who my sister really was. I just didn't want to see it. She looked directly at Miles, her eyes clear and focused. You saw it, though. You always saw it. You tried to protect me, to protect us, and I threw it back in your face. Miles felt something shift inside him, not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the anger he'd carried for so long. I'm not asking for another chance, Cheryl said quickly. I know that door is closed, and rightly so. I'm not even asking for forgiveness. Why did? She shook her head. Some things can't be undone. Why are you telling me this? Miles asked quietly. Because you deserve to hear it, Cheryl replied. Because I need to say it. Because the truth matters, even when it's too late to change anything. Miles nodded slowly. Thank you, he said, and meant it. Are you happy, Miles? Cheryl asked, the same question she'd asked months earlier, but with a different tone, now genuine rather than desperate, curious rather than pleading. Yes, Miles said. I am. Good, Cheryl said, and for the first time, she seemed to truly mean it. That's good. I'm glad. They talked for another hour, not about reconciliation or the past, but about the present, about Miles' new house, his expanding business, about Ethan's first words, Cheryl's tentative steps toward financial independence, about Jack's confession and Delaney's downfall. It wasn't friendship. Too much had happened for that. But it was civil, almost peaceful. Yes, they prepared to leave. Cheryl hesitated. Can I ask you one more thing? Something I've wondered for a while now. Miles nodded. Do you regret it? Any of it? Meeting me? Marrying me? All of it? Miles considered the question carefully. No, he said finally. I don't regret the good years. They were real. What I regret is that they ended the way they did. Cheryl nodded, accepting his answer. I regret that too, she said softly. More than you'll ever know. They walked to the door together, stepping outside into the late afternoon sunlight. Miles' new truck was parked at the curb, a visual reminder of how much had changed, how far he'd come since the day Cheryl had announced she would be a surrogate for her sister. Goodbye, Miles, Cheryl said, extending her hand formally. Miles shook it, the gesture oddly fitting for this final farewell. Goodbye, Cheryl. He watched her walk away, not with the desperate backward glances of previous encounters, but with steady steps and straight shoulders. She had finally accepted the reality of their situation, the permanence of his decision, the consequences of her choices. As Miles drove home, he felt the last weights of the past lifting from his shoulders. The divorce was final, the house sold, the financial entanglements resolved. Cheryl had acknowledged her mistakes. Delaney was facing justice. Jack had confirmed everything Miles had suspected from the beginning. Miles had walked away with everything intact. His finances, his business, his dignity, his future. He had found someone new who respected his boundaries and shared his values. He had built a life free from the chaos and manipulation that had marked the end of his marriage. He had never forgiven. He had never forgotten. And he had never compromised on what he knew to be right. not his baby, not his problem, and now, not his concern either. The past was finally, truly behind him. Ahead lay only the future he had chosen, the life he had built for himself brick by careful brick on the solid foundation of his own principles. Miles smiled as he turned onto his street, his new house waiting for him, Abigail coming over for dinner later, his business thriving, his conscience clear. Some people called him cold, unfeeling, cruel even, but Miles knew the truth. He was simply a man who meant what he said, who stood by his principles, who refused to be dragged down by the poor choices of others. And in the end, that had made all the difference.